Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Forums That Matter, community service of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I'm Ed Covington. I'm a member of the Forum Committee, and I'm the coordinator of this morning's discussion, which has both in-person and virtual audiences. Our topic today is Confronting Authoritarianism. Our speaker will speak until about 9:30, followed which we will have Q&A until 10. The microphones will be passed to our in-person audience, and we will ask the virtual audience to click on the Q&A box if they have questions. Also, virtual viewers can turn closed captioning on or off at their pleasure. Please be sure your phones are silenced. The program is recorded and will be available in a few days on our website at uucleveland.org. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cherie Strachan and to thank you for being here, contributing expertise and time to our endeavors. Dr. Strachan received her PhD in 2000 from State University of New York at Albany as a professor of political science at the University of Akron. She's also director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics, which is dedicated to preparing students for professional political careers, in addition to promoting public spirited civic and political participation among the broader electorate. Her political science research combines interest in political participation, voluntary civic and political organizations, and political communication. Recent work explores the Me Too movement and women's political ambition, as well as the effects of partisan polarization, rudeness, and civility on political engagement. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I try to say yes as often as I possibly can, both because it is part of the mission of the Bliss Institute to be a good steward of place and to be a resource for our broader community, but also because I feel like my profession is a vocation, right? Like that I owe this back to people because I get the luxury of being a tenured full professor. So I have to pay it forward a little bit when asked to speak. So basically today I'd like to talk about 3 points, sort of how we got here, because it's hard to unwind a bad place where you are in politics or as a society if you don't really understand the circumstances that led you there. And then 2 potential solutions. So we always leave with some hope and some things that we can do. So how did we get here? So I study, one of the things that I study as a political communication scholar is civility, rudeness, threats of violence. Over a decade ago, I did research that scared me, right? Over a decade ago, I was doing research where I was like, normally in American politics, you see around a realigning election, you see a spike in levels of rudeness and threats of violence or sort of intensity. And then you'll have a realigning election, FDR, lots of unrest prior to a spike, and then it comes back down, right? And people come back to deliberation and legitimate opposition. And over 10 years ago, I was looking at our political process and saying, we need, where's the realignment? Where's the coming back down? And it just kept escalating and escalating. And we haven't, it just has, since for the past decade, we've just been getting worse and worse. So how did we get here? Why does it look so polarized? We are incredibly polarized. People who study civility, like myself, have been looking at escalating rudeness and threats of violence. People who study partisan polarization, the ideological differences and sort of separation and spread between the 2 parties. We are incredibly polarized right now. Much more than we have been, right, in any time in the recent past. So how did we get here where we feel like we're on opposite sides, where we feel like there's not a covering like we're all Americans, and even if you disagree with me, it's legitimate opposition, that we feel like there's an internal enemy. So how did we get here? So one of the books that I use quite often is a book for my students that I have them read called Why We Vote. Why do people ever participate in politics in the first place? And in that, I don't have like a diagram up here with me, but you can envision it with me. In that book, there's this U-shaped curve where on either side, people will participate at very high levels. And if you don't have one of those two things, you hit a nadir, right, where people are not participating at all. And this is basically Madison and Tocqueville, right? One of the reasons why you would participate in politics at high levels is because you have an intrinsic sense of civic identity, because you understand that your self-interest, rightly understood, is to give up some of your time to pay attention to politics, to be informed, to participate, to be invited into the process and say yes, and to participate. Politics is best when people have a high sense of civic identity, and politics is, and you're in a subcommittee, like arguing about what to spend the budget on, right? It's best when it's boring. It's best when it's a subcommittee meeting, right? About, do we do this program or that program, or how much of our taxes go to this or that? That's high civic engagement for public spirited reasons. When people don't have high levels of civic identity and robust political socialization, there is a temptation to pursue life, liberty, and happiness in other ways, right? We have the freedom to pursue being an entrepreneur, checking out, foisting off the civic obligations onto other people who you trust to pay attention. This is actually what Tocqueville said would happen to us. If you read Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, from his visits in the 1800s, he said the biggest threat to American individualism was to American democracy was rugged individualism, where people would, because individualism encourages you to be selfish, would check out of the political process and choose to spend their time pursuing happiness, right? Because they had the freedom to do so, making money, being an entrepreneur, spending time with friends and family, doing the other things that are recreational and bring us joy and happiness in other ways. So when we do that, participation drops to a nadir, right? The other reason on the other side of that U-shaped curve, why people can participate at high rates, why would they bother, is when they're factionalized. If you perceive that there is an existential threat to your status and well-being from the other side, and you think that politics is a flat-out zero-sum game, and someone else, if you don't run in and grab it, they're going to take it from you, and you feel threatened and afraid, this is Madison, Federalist number 10, right? We have a tendency to want to identify with our own demographic groups, with our own economic, social classes, with people who share our religious preferences, to feel threatened by other people or try to advance the interests of people like ourselves, perhaps at the expense of others. So what happened around the 1970s was that the robust political socialization, the sources of robust political socialization in the United States had begun to erode, right? So the places where people had gone to learn public spiritedness, where they had gone to learn self-interest rightly understood, and the skills of the art of organizing, the skills of knowing that who wants to read a newspaper every day? Who wants to pay attention to what's happening on city council? It does take time and attention away from things that we might, I'm perhaps not normal. I read about 5 newspapers a day and it's a hobby. I have come to learn that that's not particularly typical. Like, most people don't get enjoyment from that, right? So the sources of robust political socialization had eroded. And as a result, participation was declining. And politicians still need to win elections, right? We still have the infrastructure of a democracy. We still have elections. First past the post, who gets the most votes, still wields incredible amounts of political power and authority. And so there's every incentive for politicians on both sides around the 1970s to go, well, how do I get them to vote? Rebuilding civic identity and skills and democratic capacity is a long-term process. They're on a short-term calendar of trying to win the next election. They also, at the same time, got their hands on communication technology that made it so much easier. And it's just been getting, every 5 years, it just levels up with their ability to do negative advertising, tailored, careful messages now through social media and pop-ups, direct mailing. It became so much easier to carefully tailor a negative sort of, you should be afraid, you should be afraid, you should be afraid of the other side. And we have had a steady diet of that from politicians who still needed to, if you're not going to pay attention and vote because you're already here, and I can show up and have a conversation with you, then they have every incentive to scare us, right? And that we've had a steady diet of that since the 70s, decades and decades of fear mongering from politicians on both sides, right? Like, this is not a partisan game. It's from both sides. And so basically what has happened is this is not a Trump effect, right? This is a long-term, right, erosion of public spiritedness that has been replaced by the most politically active people being factionalized and fearing the other side, and thinking that the other side is a threat, to the point where we are now. But it took decades of party sorting, decades of pulling people into different camps. People like, you should be afraid of the other side. People like, you should be afraid of the other side, to the point where we no longer feel like other Americans are legitimate, right? To the point where we feel like there is an enemy within. That's problematic, because if you really feel like other people are the threat and other Americans are the threat, it feels existential to your own status and well-being, and that's the point at which people give up democratic norms. It's so important that I win. It's so important that my side wins, because they're going to do bad things to me, because they're going to do X, Y, and Z to us if they win and wield power, that I should be afraid, and then winning at any cost. It's not like, well, legitimate opposition, I might not like those policies, I might not benefit as much if that candidate wins, but it's still America, right? And we'll come back to the next election, and we'll come back to the next cycle, and we'll do a better job of hashing it out and putting up a better candidate. That kind of sort of, well, you're still my president, you're still the president of all the people. That sentiment, when you are completely factionalized, goes away, and the support for democratic norms goes away, because you start to feel like you should win at all costs, and that you should sacrifice those norms of, like, respecting the institutional processes and the things that preserve democracy in the long run, because you feel so threatened. It has taken decades to get us here. A combination of the erosion of voluntary association and a decline in membership in things like this, that have just disappeared over time, and the civic infrastructure of the networked, overlapping voluntary associations where people had membership, where they learned civic skills, learned that they were supposed to. It wasn't in college, right? The best source of political socialization is voluntary association, right? Churches, unions, Chamber of Commerce, Elk, Woodsman, that went away. We replaced it with communication technology to poke people with a stick and scare them. All right, so what do? Right. So the first solution that I would offer to you, there's a really good professor at Harvard who studies how do you take out dictators. Their research has been about other countries, right, pushing back against political leaders that don't accept democratic norms, political leaders that, where people want to establish democracy. And Erica Chenoweth has started to turn that lens on our own country and look at, do the same tactics work here? It's basically people power, right? While you have a right of association, while you have freedom of speech, even if those things are imperfect, leverage them to rebuild the civic infrastructure in order to engage in disruptive politics, in order to push back. And so Chenoweth's argument is that nonviolent civil disobedience and the things that you have to do in order to undertake those things help to rebuild the civic infrastructure that you need to sustain democracy in the long run, right? So if you want to engage in protest politics or hold a rally or gain attention for any kind of cause through bringing lots and lots of people together, through engaging in the politics of disruption, to point out that we're not happy with this and we want things to change, or we want different leaders in charge. In order to do that effectively, you have to rebuild civic infrastructure. right? You have to rebuild the kinds of deliberative voluntary associations in order to wield disruptive politics effectively. I'll give you Black Lives Matter as an example. Black Lives Matter started with tweets, right? It started on social media. It got its name from social media. People first started showing up at rallies in St. Louis because of awareness of online. It really did not become effective, and it was effective at changing policies at the city and state level across the entire country, right? It did not become effective until they built a federated infrastructure of local chapters, networked local chapters across the entire country. That's the point at which, right, they became effective. And then what do you learn from rebuilding that civic infrastructure? It's very Tocquevillian, right? What do you learn the art of organizing? You learn how to give a speech. You learn about your own government and what the levers are to push. You learn to deliberate around like what are the most effective strategies. All of the things that would let you be an effective politician, all of the things that would allow you to be a good, effective citizen, you relearn by rebuilding that civic infrastructure in order to push back. The most successful, Chenoweth started out by saying that prior to her dissertation research, which was about this, was very persuaded. She came from an ROTC sort of military background before she got her PhD, and really thought like you hold up the French Revolution and the American Revolution as how you get a democracy, and was really persuaded that you got a democracy through violence. Her own research, right? Like we have revolutions, right? At the point of a gun, you take out dictators. And her own research proved that hypothesis completely wrong. You get democracies through people power. The ones that are most successful at toppling dictators or replacing authoritarianism with people who are democratic are people power. But then think of what you need to make a democracy function in the long run. Think of the civic infrastructure that you need of people who understand, like we have 80,000, a little bit over 80,000 units of government in the United States. Multiply that by every city council that has 5 to 10 members, by every special water board that has 5 to 10 members, by every place that you need a mayor, right? By all the legislatures and city councils that you need all of these people to step forward and understand how the process works and how to be effective and participate. And so by building the kind of leverage that it takes to coordinate those activities, you're actually building the kind of electorate that you need to make democracy sustainable in the long run, right? At the point of the gun, where you reward people for violence, you get Stalin, right? Stalin was popular in the Bolshevik movement because he was a thug, right? And he was like the mafia, right? He would go threaten to burn down businesses if they didn't pay him off, or it would commit guerrilla tactics to get money to give to the Bolsheviks, right? To engage in pushing back against the czar. People who learn to take and seize power through violent tactics rule through violent tactics. When you rely on things like the civil rights movement, you get John Lewis. When you rely on Black Lives Matter, right, you get Cori Bush, right? So you get people who understand how to rule through deliberating, compromising, listening, right, advocating, organizing, right? So that's the first solution. And there was just a piece by Rebecca Solnit, who's the academic who came up with the term mansplaining. She wrote an essay maybe about a decade ago about men explain things to me. She just had a piece in The Guardian, which I shared, and I can reshare the link. We don't see all of the things that are happening right now to organize and push back. There are activities across, it was much more visible under the first Trump administration because it was this big, huge march in DC that got like tons and tons of attention. There's actually more nonviolent civil disobedience and disruptive politics and organizing, and also more lawsuits from things like the ACLU happening right now than during the first Trump administration. Exponentially more is happening now, and so than in the first term. And so there's lots and lots happening that we just don't see because it's not getting the attention of the media, and it's not all over the place because it's happening in pocketed, ways across the entire country. So that is happening. And then the second thing that I would say is it's really hard. I know that, there's all sorts of initiatives happening right now about reconnecting across polarization and reconnecting across these differences and persuading people. And I would say, of course, I would never say don't do that, right? I want people to be able to go home and have Thanksgiving dinner with family members of different party identifications. I want, my students, we work really hard at the Bliss Institute to make sure that people across partisan differences are capable of being in the same room and having conversations with one another, because that's what we need to come back to. But it's also really hard. I think that will help us nibble around the edges of this polarization. It's really hard once people are truly factionalized, like the really hardcore, truly factionalized on one side or the other. It's really hard because we hate cognitive dissonance. And we choose to pay attention to things and process things that reinforce where we are. Once we're polarized, once we're afraid of each other, once we've hit that level, it's really hard. It's a big, heavy lift to pull people back to the center. And so the other thing that I think we can do is to make sure that that the next generation, right? So yes, do all of those things, but don't be frustrated if they're not as effective as you think they should be, because it's hard, right? It's a really hard, heavy lift. And so the other thing is we need to rethink civic education. There used to be, and whether or not this needs to be done by the public school system or whether this needs to be done by the reinvigorated civic infrastructure and civic base is something that we can talk about. There used to be courses on civics that were more than just memorization, right? And it depends on whether you had those classes, because federalism, right, varies. The state implementations varied, and the local level kind of depended on your school board. But there used to be courses that were not just about a history class, which is also important. There weren't just a history class about memorize these dates, but there were civics courses about understanding how to deliberate, organize a project, and make something happen, even if it was just in your own small community, so that students, like the kinds of things that you would learn in voluntary associations, were being replicated in the actual, like, formal civic education to reinforce. And so we need to find time and space to make sure that I do this work. The American Political Science Association has pushed back and not wanted to do that kind of civic training for a really long time, because political science was supposed to be a science, and we were supposed to be a discipline, and we would just teach our students disciplinary knowledge. And I've been a big, loud voice with my colleagues to say, how many of your students are going to get a PhD? Your professional obligation to your students is to teach them how to be good citizens. And that includes knowledge, but it also includes skills, right? The skills of organizing and participating in information processing and all the things that good citizens need. But it also means teaching them that using those things, not for their own personal benefit, but for democracy, to sustain democracy, making sure they have intrinsic civic identity, is also part of our professional obligation. So that by the time students come out of a college degree, not just at the University of Akron, but at institutions across the entire country, we have civic and political leaders, right? College-educated civic and political leaders who understand, right, that they have this obligation to be public-spirited citizens and political leaders. But we also need to roll this back down, right? Not everyone goes to college, right? So we need to roll this back down and make sure that kind of civic learning is taking place, the hands-on civic learning, right? Of actually practicing deliberation, of actually implementing a project, knowing how a budget works, knowing how bylaws work. Lost art. Used to have students that would come to campus. We didn't have to teach them Robert's rules and how to organize. They don't know anymore, right? It is lost because organizations like this, right, where you would have junior committees for the students where they would participate and learn parliamentary procedure, budget, programming, all the things that look like government in a democracy, are just my students don't even know anymore that that's lost. My generation looks and says, this has been lost. Why don't we have what our parents had? But the people coming up behind me don't even know that they were supposed to learn that, right? So replacing that through some kind of formal civic education, I think will ensure that we don't have to go through this deep polarization again in the future. So I think it's about time for me to stop and take questions. So like that was sort of like how we got here, but then two things to be hopeful about. Yeah. Do you want me to call on people or someone else?
Thank you, Cherie.
Yeah.
That was wonderful. I thought you were going to give us things to think about. Instead, you've given us work to do.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether polarization sometimes doesn't serve a useful purpose. Like, I noticed recently that there's some polarization on the right. People like Carlson and Candace Owens are challenging the elite MAGA neocon establishment which has emerged and which comprises the authoritarian regime that we're experiencing now. So I'm wondering whether all polarization is bad or not.
So, I mean, I could give you a different historical example. There was polarization around slavery that led to our Civil War, right? And so I wouldn't look back and say I regret that, right? I would say that we had to come, you had to have a line in the sand, and people had to say, no more, and stand up and force other citizens to choose one side or the other. Right? Unfortunately led to a civil war because they weren't willing to compromise. Fortunately, that's the only time it's come to a civil war in the United States. I would say, though, that you have to be careful which issues and it's not my place ever, right, as an academic to tell people what their line in the sand or what their moral issues ought to be, right? We need a robust public sphere of other people deciding what those lines in the sand are. So it's never my place to say, this is the line in the sand that you ought to be polarized about, and this is where there truly is an existential fight, right, where we ought to trigger this kind of a reckoning. But that's one example where I can at least historically go back and go, yes, I'm glad we did that. Right. So sometimes there is a moral issue, right, or a public issue that needs to be addressed where people have to say, this is not okay, and I'm going to draw a line in the sand, and I'm not. You are the other side is not good for us, and we have to draw a line in the sand there. And hopefully then what happens, hopefully we can have those sort of come to Jesus moments in American politics without having another civil war, right? Hopefully we can have those moments and hash this out through electoral politics, right? And so like FDR is another example, right? Do we regulate the economy or not regulate the economy, right? We had a realigning election and the electorate tipped toward FDR and the Democrats became a majority party for a generation because they said, we can't have boom and bust and let people starve, and we're going to have to do something about it, right? So hopefully we aren't so polarized that we come to threats of violence and enacting violence that become more systematic. Hopefully we can manage it through the electoral process.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I'm totally intrigued by your claim that you read 5 papers every day. Because I consider myself kind of plugged in, but nowhere near that. I have heard from numerous analysts that there's a problem with media, that they don't understand how to cover the Trump administration because they're not used to calling presidents abnormal. Normally presidents are treated with some sort of, if not reverence, at least they get some leeway. So my question is, I'm curious what 5 papers you read, and do you find that they are both sides in issues that you think, no, this is not a both sides thing?
Yeah, so I skim a ton of different papers. Like, you know, when you hit like if I'm grading papers and I need a break and other people would go for a walk and I like skim a newspaper. Or, you know, like you're waiting for an elevator and I, you know, or sitting in a waiting room and I just pull up. So I try to do the prestige press. And I try to vary which ones I look at because I have conservative and liberal students in my classroom, and I'm trying to make sure I understand things from many different points of view. So I'll do the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, but I also do the Akron Beacon Journal and the Akron Signal because I need to know what's happening in my own community. You know, I'll do some Cleveland papers, I'll do some Cincinnati papers, so that I understand state politics. And I don't sit and read them cover to cover, like the entire newspaper, right? I'm like, you know, sometimes I'll just skim and read the first paragraph. Sometimes I just read the headlines, right? I'm just skimming, and the ones that are of interest to me, I drill down in. So like, it's misleading for me to say I fully read 5 newspapers a day, but I definitely skim that many, right? On the regular. It's part of my job. And I do think that the media have trouble. The media has trouble covering anything that shifts away from journalistic news, like the news values. The news values, if you go to journalism school or if you've been trained as a journalist and had an editor reject your story ideas and tell you to go back to the drawing board, conflict and scandal and 2 sides are part of the hook for so many stories about American politics. And so, you know, even you can watch CNN, right? And they have to have the split screen, right? They have to have the split screen because they have to have 2 sides telling you from the 2 partisan perspective. So I think that anytime journalism is asked to cover stories in different ways that don't fit with those traditional hooks, they struggle with it, right? And maybe currently struggle with it because of this particular thing that we're going through right now with polarization and problems, but have also historically struggled with it. The other thing they struggle with is anything in depth, right? So in-depth coverage of policy issues. Once they've covered an issue once, it's old news, right? So if something happens and they need to cover policy issues and, you know, implications of changes in policies again, that's old news and it's not timely, right? So in-depth, sort of the things that academics would do around public policy issues, you know, around how that's changed or the implications of subtle changes in policy implementation are really hard to get out of newspapers. So yeah, finding maybe ProPublica, right? Maybe finding some alternatives on Substack, you know, might serve some of the agenda of what you're looking for in a better way.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's very informative. And I wanted, this is the gentlest of pushbacks on your notion or thought that one of the signs of a democracy in trouble is when we see the other side not as an opponent, but as an existential threat. The problem is, what if they in fact are an existential threat?
Yeah.
And if I were an immigrant worker in the United States, it would be hard for me to see law enforcement, and especially ICE, any other way. And I once had a chance to talk to a Hungarian academic after Orban came to power. And she said, you know, we didn't recognize that at some point Orban ceased to be an opponent and wanted to simply keep the democratic forms, but empty them of any content. And I just worry sometimes that we ask everyone not to get upset when in fact maybe we should be.
So I would say that what happens is the process, like what's been happening for decades, right? The purposefully framing the other side, like not right now, but starting in the 70s, starting when we got our hands on communication technology and politicians were trying to replace the erosion of voluntary associations and move people to vote through fear mongering, right? And maybe they always fear mongered, but it became really effective with communication technology. I don't know that they fully realized what they were doing, because now we're at the point where people are rejecting democratic norms because they see losing as right, because they see losing as intolerable, right? And so like with Orban as well, right? Like, so you willingness to violate the democratic norm, willing to violate due process, right? Long historic, not just in the United States, but long, deep histories of traditions that evolved over hundreds of years in Western culture as protection in a democracy, protection of individual rights in a democracy, being willing to be pushed aside, things that we have furnished and cherished because of this long process of fear mongering. And I don't think that politicians, they were just trying to win elections short term. And they didn't realize that the long-term effect would be, right, oh, now we've produced at least pieces of the American electorate who are willing to sacrifice and let those things go because they're so afraid, right? So I think that I would just put it in perspective and say the initial fear mongering, I'm not saying that there aren't real reasons, right, to be deeply concerned, right, and to push back or to engage in the kind of disruptive politics that we're seeing all over the country, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks again for an interesting talk. And I'm just wondering with your students, well, with so many young people attached to phones and everything, how, and it's much easier to look on a phone or an internet something blog that's entertaining and makes you feel good and get away from what's going on outside. How can we hope that those tools could be used to engage our kids with civic action?
Yeah. I do honestly, this is a very old-fashioned answer. I do honestly think it comes back to cultivating when people are young, when people are, and we have extended adolescence up through like, and ability to engage in character formation. My political science colleagues who think they need to be neutral are like having a fit, like, what, character development? What are you talking about? But I do think that we have to engage in character development and to whom much is given, much is expected. If you want to live in a place where you have freedom to be entrepreneurial, freedom to pursue an education, freedom to complain and criticize and to organize and petition government, right? If you want all the things that are the legacy of Western constitutional democracy, then you've got to step up, right? And then you've got to step up, and we need to do a better job of cultivating that, a sense of shame when people fail at those kinds of tasks. And that, there's this, an older book, so the young people that were interviewed in it and surveyed in it would have been millennials, the millennial generation. It's a little bit dated, but there was a book called A New Civic Engagement, ? And it was a generational comparison. And when they asked an open-ended question about what does it mean to be a good citizen, each successive generation, when they had the chance to answer that question, gave answers that were less and less tied to civic obligation and performance of political duties. So that by the time you got to millennials, it made it sound like you had asked them what it meant to be a good Samaritan, right? So there were, I just remember some of the answers that were in the book, and they said things like, but I'm a good person, I follow the laws, I don't do drugs, I mean, you're like obedient, you're obedient to the laws. You think that's what it means to be a good citizen? You're doing what you're told to do. And then also like a notion of like, well, if people want to do those things, that's fine. Like if you're interested in politics and you know, that's your hobby, that's your thing, like feel free to go do it, but I don't feel any obligation to do it myself. That is not going to work. That long term is not going to work because there will be the only people who will be active in politics are people like me who are weird, right? Right? Who are like, well, I want to read the newspapers, or people who are factionalized and intense and afraid. And you've got to have that counterbalance of moderate, boring, stable, sober, right? People who are willing to go, yeah, I'll go to the meeting, I'll go to the boring meeting, I'll do the prep work in advance so we can decide how to spend our $5,000, right? We've got to get them back to that. And rebuilding it is important. So my answer is like, what would you use your freedom for? Whether it's freedom to read a blog, you know, listen to a podcast, you know, where are you going to take yourself? Using the new array of communication technology and internet and all the things that we have access to, where are you going to take yourself? What are you going to use that for? People aren't going to use it to be good citizens unless they believe they're supposed to be, right? So that's about 10 or 15 years ago, I switched half of my research agenda away from traditional political science like topics. I still had to do the traditional things because my colleagues will give me stink eye if I don't. Like you've got to have a traditional research agenda, but I switched half of my research agenda to political science, pedagogy, and teaching and learning to go, how do we more effectively teach students to become good citizens? And we need more of that.
Considering that most people are not now getting their information from newspapers, and the fact that the social media algorithms seem to feed on outrage, would you comment on the role of these algorithms in promoting and perpetuating polarization, and do you have any antidotes to it?
Yeah, I actually teach a mixed class called Civic Engagement and Political Participation that has undergrads and grad students at the University of Akron. And we just talked about this on Thursday with the algorithms, but also with people like choosing bubbles on purpose to avoid cognitive dissonance, right? And we talked about, what are the ways that you get people to stop? And I think we just need, I think we are asking more of people now in terms of political information processing than we perhaps had to do in the past, in part because the opinion leaders are gone. Not everybody read a bunch of newspapers every day, but you would know someone in your labor union, at the chamber, at your church, who was an opinion leader and could help you sort of make sense and process political information. And that's been substantially eroded. So I do think that we have a much heavier lift in terms of teaching the civic skills of information processing and making young people aware of, what they're doing to themselves when they only, I had a student years ago, probably a little bit like 8 years ago now, who said, oh, I don't need to read the newspapers because if anything important happens, my friends will post about it. My friends who are interested in politics will post about it. Well, you know what they're reposting is not something that's truly informative. They're reposting two people fighting with each other on CNN, right? The most caustic sort of stuff. So we do have to get them to recognize what happens when they only rely on that, and to replace it with seeking out true information. But I will say that they are much more sophisticated about understanding what those algorithms are doing to them and how they work than my generation. Like young people get it, right? They understand that like, oh, what I clicked on two things and now I'm being taken down this rabbit hole and I don't like it, so I need to stop. So if we can get them to have the civic identity and want real information, they will know how to get it. It's cultivating that civic identity in the first place.
I come from, I'm an immigrant in the late 1959 from the former Yugoslavia. And I was very young, but there was always a discussion of politics all the time, everywhere where I came from. In villages and you'd have 15 factions, but they would always discuss it. I came here and you never heard that. It was, oh, I don't do politics. We don't discuss politics. We don't talk about that. Now that's been my experience throughout, and that hasn't changed until maybe now. And I think that's part of how we got here, or who we are. You have a question? Did you? I as a comment, and I guess, what are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I completely agree. Choosing when the infrastructure that pulled Americans into public life, the infrastructure of robust, anybody who came to the United States that observed American politics early on, like de Tocqueville, if you want to, Americans like to think we're so special and like, the city on a hill and all that, like really the thing that made Americans special was leveraging the right of association to just like overfound voluntary associations. Anytime there were issues in their community, found an organization, found an association, to the point where, there was research in the 60s when political scientists first got their hands on survey research. They looked at the civic culture in the United States compared to other places. They had to change the coding sheet for voluntary associations in the United States because we were founding so many different kinds of associations that didn't exist anywhere else, right? The American impulse to leverage the right of association is the thing that taught us how to be citizens and taught us how to talk about politics in a polite, deliberative way, right? Not fighting about it and like screaming at each other, but like to truly solve problems. And then gave us the infrastructure to actually do something about it. And when that eroded in the 70s and people stopped joining those kinds of organizations, the thing that pulled us in and gave us the capacity to talk about politics consistently went away, right? And was replaced with increasing nastiness. So yeah, I 100% agree. And this is exactly what Tocqueville predicted, right? That we would opt out of politics and choose to do other things, that this is the threat of rugged individualism, that we would choose, selfishness would drive us to do other things with our time and energy. And we would stop talking about and paying attention to politics. Power loves the vacuum, right? If we're not going to do it, someone else is. Power loves the vacuum. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering what your experience has been with AI in your classroom, with students using AI for their papers. And the reason I bring it up is this may be further the dumbing down of Americans. And, in the past, I remember in Shaper High School years ago, we did term papers. We had to do research and footnotes, which actually taught critical thinking. And so I'm wondering, this new technological revolution, what impact that will have on people's ability to think and make choices.
We are just trying to wrap our heads around what to do with AI and how to deal with it. There's always, I think sometimes academics are always a little bit behind. We're like, oh, wait, what? Our students are doing what? Like, oh, no. And so there's a task force by the American Political Science Association. It's a presidential task force to make recommendations and start to think about what to do with it. In the meantime, I know just by, I don't have numbers or statistics or anything, but just from talking to people, a lot of my colleagues have returned to Blue Book. Do you remember the Blue Book?
Yeah.
Okay, Blue Books went away. My students don't even know how to write in cursive. Yeah. It's appalling to me when I realized I have a 22-year-old, and when he was, I don't know, like 8 or 9, I realized that he did not know how to read or write in cursive. And my mother is like a fourth grade, was a fourth grade elementary school teacher. So I got the penmanship, right, practice books, and I made him, learn to read and write in cursive because I was appalled. But yeah, my students can't even write effectively in clear handwriting in a Blue Book because they stopped teaching them cursive, which to me was appalling when I realized it. But I do know that my colleagues have gone back to Blue Book exams. And I've been debating, my classes that I teach at the university are hybrid. So they're like some of my students are participating online and some of my students are participating in the classroom because we have so many non-traditional professionals, right, who are coming back to our master's degree. And so I'm struggling with how do you make someone who's taking the class online, like write a Blue Book? So there are some, I mean, you can use a lockdown browser and make them turn their camera on themselves while they write, right? Or while they type, which feels kind of big brotherish to me, but maybe I have to go there. So they are starting to grapple with it. And I know a lot of my colleagues that still just teach face-to-face in the classroom, 100% have gone back to Blue Book. And then they're struggling to read the students' handwriting because they can't write. But yeah, I'm sure the students don't like it, but if you're going to use AI to write your essays, here you go, write it in front of me. Other people are switching back to oral exams, right? So maybe they'll make you write something, but then you have to have a 5-minute meeting with your professor to explain why you said those things, right? Like just some checks. So I don't think we have a perfect solution yet, but people are responding.
So I have a couple of things. Cherie mentioned Rebecca Solnit's article. She sent the link to Ed, who sent it to me, and now I've put it in the chat. So people online can read it, and also when you see the recording, you'll be able to see it there. It's a really good article. I struggle all the time with the term right versus left, and wish that we could talk about just issues. And in conjunction with that, I struggle with, I say we're losing democracy, and someone else will say that we vote, we have elections. Could you give a response to that?
Yeah, I would say that voting is the tip of the iceberg of what it means to live in a democracy, right? And that's the problem with the erosion of this sense of intrinsic civic identity of what your actual obligations are. If you think your obligations are just to vote, and that's all it takes, I mean, I would like to see more people vote, but if you have been trained, unfortunately, that the political socialization is eroded, if you have been trained that the only thing that you're supposed to do is show up and vote when you're offered these two very limited choices, and that you're not supposed to be an active participant in your community, and that you're not supposed to deliberate, and that you're not supposed to help to solve problems through civic life, right? And other forms of participation, that's a pretty thin, weak definition of civic obligation. And you're also going to be stuck with choices that other people are pushing in front of you that you might not like. So yeah, we need to return to a more robust political socialization and rebuild the civic infrastructure. But I do think it's possible, like as long as you have a right of association, I tell my students are sometimes very sweet, but historically, and things are rough for young people, right? I got through with very few student loans. I was able to get tenure track jobs. I don't have to worry about my health insurance. So financially, I think my young people right now are really, really struggling. Like buying a house, having children feels impossible. So I don't want to minimize that. But when I have, 20-something-year-olds in my class who are like, it's so hard. How do we do it? I once had a non-traditional student in my class who was an older African-American woman. And let me tell you, she gave them a lecture, right? Like, I'm sorry, has someone lynched someone in your backyard for trying to vote? I'm sorry, like, has anyone burned a cross because you founded a voluntary association and organized a protest? Yes, there is pushback right now on right of association and free, like Navalny, has someone poisoned your underwear drawer because you decided to run for office, right? And tried to kill you, right? Like people have faced up against far more personally. I'm not saying that there aren't issues to be dealt with right now, but like in terms of the personal pushback that any single person would experience, while you have an imperfect right of association, while you have an imperfect right of free speech, my God, please leverage it, right? Please leverage it while you have it. So I loved that I had that older African-American woman in my class because she could say it with so much authority than I could, right? Like, do you want it or not?
A question, you talked a lot about voluntary organizations as a breeding ground for learning civic engagement. What local organizations get you excited about how they're connecting with people in their 20s and 30s?
Well, that's the problem, is that people in their 20s and 30s don't even know that this is what, I think there needs to be, and I try to do this on campus, and I've been trying to think about ways to do it in a more systematic way. They don't even know that that's missing. I know it's missing. You know, I can see, like, look back at history and know it's missing, but young people don't even know it's missing. And so one of the things that we're doing at the University of Akron is I provided a small budget for the public relations students in an applied class to do a public relations campaign to persuade other students to join student organizations. We have this, and then if it works, then I can write a paper about it and I can get other professors on other campuses to do it. Like we've artificially preserved civil society on college campuses because it's part of the student affairs office. So that might be, at least for students that are on a college campus, that might be the place. And then I talk to my students about it, and I'm like, you know how happy the League of Women Voters would be if 20 of you showed up or 15 of you showed up? Like you'd be chair of a committee in 2 weeks, right? You know, or I belong to, there's a Polish American Citizens Club. Cheap imported beer, let me tell you, good beer. At the Polish American Citizens Club in, it's a $30 membership for the year, and you can go in and buy like a liter of beer for $4. Like voluntary associations are for more than politics, right? They're for other good things that we want to cultivate and do. And I tell my students, like, you know how happy, you don't even have to be Polish to join. You have to be Polish to join the governing body, right? My husband's Polish. And so I tell my students, like, do you know how happy they would be if you showed up and participated in their activities, like those kinds of things? And my students don't even know it exists. So we need to do a better job of explaining to them what was lost and how important it was, and then giving them the opportunity to either reinvigorate the infrastructure that's left, or invent things that are entirely new.
This is the last forum of the fall season. Our next forum will be January 18th, same time, same place. It will feature Earl Lycan, who's a former mayor of Shaker Heights and now a very popular Siegel College lecturer. The program will be on what divides us as Americans, a very good follow-up to today. If you'd like to receive weekly reminders of forums, there's a clipboard on the back table that you can fill out. I think Susan also has a clipboard, if she's still here, that she could circulate. You're welcome to attend our 10:15 Sunday service, either upstairs in the sanctuary or on our YouTube page. Today we have a guest minister, Reverend Dr. Matthew Johnson, who is a Unitarian congregational life consultant and a third-generation Unitarian. Believe me, that's unusual, this religion. Tickling the ivories will be UUCC's pianist, Karen Tooley. To see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website at uucleveland.org. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week, and thank you, Cherie.
Oh, yeah.